I'm Daniel James, and you're listening to 7am. On Monday, Parliament will return early to debate new laws to deal with hate speech and gun ownership. The legislation has been drafted in a hurry, under mounting pressure in the aftermath of the Bondi terror attack. But support for the bill has already fractured. The Coalition says it goes too far, the Greens say it doesn't go far enough. Both want more time to consider changes. The debate over what is and isn't hate is unfolding at a time of deep political division, with consequences not just for Parliament, but for Australia's cultural institutions. Today, CEO of Cheek Media and host of the Big Small Talk podcast, Hannah Ferguson, on the politics of hate speech and how a fight over free expression spilled into the arts. It's Saturday, January 17. Hannah, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you on 7am.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Let's start with the government's new hate speech legislation. Can you give us a sense of what it is they are proposing?
They're proposing a lot. It covers everything from, customs and migration changes to basically major anti-terrorism reform.
It increases the penalties for hate crimes offences. It ensures that offenders whose crimes were motivated by extremism had that factored into their sentencing. It creates a new offence for inciting hatred in order to intimidate or harass.
But I think there's two specific parts that have people most concerned. One is a new federal offence for inciting hatred.
It expands and strengthens the ban on prohibited symbols, and it makes it easier for the Minister for Home Affairs to cancel or refuse a visa for people intent on spreading hatred.
And the second is a new regime for outlawing hate groups. So they're kind of the two major aspects of this bill that are being, considered highly contentious right now.
Once an organisation is listed, it will be a criminal offence to be a member, to recruit for it, to donate or receive funds or support that group in any way.
The federal offence for inciting hatred is an interesting one because it makes it illegal to publicly promote or incite racial hatred. But the test is a reasonable person test. So it's not whether someone actually experienced intimidation, fear, harassment, or that actual hatred's been proven, but whether a reasonable person from the targeted group would feel that. So that's kind of one of the aspects that I think has come up a lot in the media in the past couple of days. And then there's the aspect with the sort of regime or scheme for prescribing hate groups, which is groups that don't fit the mold for a definition of a terrorist group, but are before that when they're engaging in acts of what would be considered hate crimes under the criminal code.
And we've already seen both the Greens and the Coalition say they won't support the bill as it stands. Why is that?
I think there's very different reasons for the Greens and the Coalition's disagreement and opposition to the bill. So we've seen from the Greens leaders like David Shoebridge, Maureen Faruqi and Larissa Waters, who are opposing the bill because they want it to consider their sort of national framework for anti-racism and expand beyond just racial issues, so into areas like protection to the LGBTQIA+ community.
We are hearing new concerns and red flags every single day. And the Greens will not be supporting this bill in its current form.
The same hateful ideology that was directed against the Jewish community at Bondi could have as easily been directed against women in positions of power or the LGBTIQ community.
Whereas the Coalition is opposing the bill for different reasons. Opposition leader Susan Lee described it as unsalvageable and said, I think explicitly, that the bill didn't contain reference to radical Islam.
The legislation does not address the real issues that gave rise to the Bondi attack. It doesn't address Islamic extremism. It doesn't address ISIS influence.
And she said the Prime Minister can't name the problem, he can't solve the problem. So we're seeing the Coalition quite contrastingly appeal to only wanting the bill to actually protect certain minority groups.
Yep, as you just said, very different reasons for not supporting the hate speech aspects of this bill. Is this a sign that the government hasn't done enough to bring their parliamentary colleagues along?
I think, yes, it is a side of that. But we always knew that following the Bondi terror attack on the 14th of December, it's only been a month. It's been a Christmas period of grief and of mourning and of a lot of harm between political parties and the messaging through the media to the public. So we always knew it was going to be contentious, highly politicised. And I think every party has fallen into the kind of tropes that the Australian public would assume of them. Mm-hmm. But I do think the government has failed on a lot of fronts. They have failed to consult the stakeholders necessary. They have failed to look at, the expert advice. And there's only been a 48-hour public consultation period for a very significant and complex piece of legislation. So not only have they failed to bring their colleagues along, they've failed to bring the country along.
If we focus on the coalition, they've been highly critical of the government for not recalling Parliament right after Bondi.
The first thing that needs to happen urgently is for the Parliament to be recalled. I haven't heard the Prime Minister give a date. I haven't heard the...
Now they're saying they can't support the bill because they are too rushed.
So this is a very, very rushed process.
From what we have seen so far, it looks pretty unsalvageable.
What does their response over the summer signal about how they're likely to approach next week?
The coalition is really right now running a political game of making a lot of noise but no clear points. They are going to flip-flop all over the place because they are rapidly losing support, not only to Labor and the Greens, but to One Nation as well. So it's really, I think, a race to the bottom on actually representing the Australian public and having reasonable conversations. And instead, presumably from my perspective, my personal opinion, is that the coalition right now are just trying to find fights and stoke division, which is exactly the opposite of what the country needs right now.
And to that point, Susan Lee wants this to be about radical Islam and anti-Semitism only. Is there a risk that Labor will fold on that approach to these laws in the same way they folded to the demands for a Royal Commission?
Absolutely. I think one of the hallmarks of Anthony Albanese's prime ministership has been a leader that is really just leaning into what the conversation that's dominating the media of the time dictates that he should do. Even with this announcement of a Royal Commission, he announced a federal review into our intelligence agencies and then backflipped despite consistently saying we were not going to hold a Royal Commission. So I think the worry here is that he is bowing to pressure instead of actually sticking to his values, despite having such a strong majority in Parliament.
So are these laws doomed to fail, given where we're at the moment?
Absolutely. I think to rush through such complex legislation that makes such significant changes, not only to our, hate speech legislation, but also to gun reform, to migration. There are so many different moving parts of this bill that arguably could be unconstitutional. But lawyers, experts haven't been given the time to peruse and provide submissions to this bill, despite it being such a complex piece of legislation. So I think right now they are doomed to fail because they do not have party support outside of Labor and they haven't consulted the necessary stakeholders to actually ensure success. And the goal of the bill is really social cohesion and to reduce extremism and reduce division. And if it continues on this path, it's going to do the exact opposite.
Coming up, from Bondi to Adelaide, and the problem of weaponising cultural sensitivity. And if we broaden things out a little bit and talk about the climate in which this legislation is being introduced into, you were set to appear at Adelaide Writers' Week. How did you first hear that Randa Abdel Fattah was uninvited?
Yeah, so last Thursday I was actually still on break overseas travelling and I received an email from the Adelaide Festival Board with an attached statement informing all participants that Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah had been removed, uninvited from the festival. Now, I quickly went online, did some searches, expecting to find some clear information as to why had she been uninvited, what were recent comments made. There was no actual quotes in the statement. There was no specific references to comments that were made. And there was this really odd conflation that I read between Dr. Abdel Fattah, her voice as a Palestinian author, and the Bondi terror attack while denying there was connection there. And the whole statement felt very funny to me. So after receiving that email from the Adelaide Festival Board and kind of reviewing the material and having a look online, I decided that the only option for me was to pull out of the festival, given that I didn't understand the context and that I believed this to be a racist act of censorship. So I immediately emailed the board, raised my concerns and pulled out of the 2 sessions I was set to participate in next month.
And you weren't alone in pulling out. What did you make of the mass boycott?
I actually thought it was an amazing moment. I think that over the last 2 years, there's been a real divide in our responses to, what I would describe as Israel's genocide against Palestinians. I think to see the silencing, the suppression of a Palestinian author by a festival board was concerning, and to see the Australian, writing and arts community quite broadly show support for Dr. Abdel Fattah was a beautiful thing, because it was an act of solidarity and an act of protest in one.
The South Australian Premier backed the board's decision and took it even further, comparing Rando's appearance to booking a far-right Zionist in the aftermath of a Zionist killing Muslims.
Could you imagine that as Premier of this state, I would actively support a far-right Zionist going to Writers' Week and speaking hateful rhetoric towards Islamic people? Of course I wouldn't. Now, the reverse has happened in this instance, and I'm not going to support that either.
Rando has now launched defamation proceedings because of this extraordinary attack on her character. What does it say to you, Hannah, that we have a political leader ultimately in charge of the event's budget making a comment like that?
It is hard for me not to see it as the continued, lobbying pressure placed on Australian institutions. And it is really hard for me to see this as anything other than an act of censorship and racism. And I think the Premier, I'm seeing a lot of the Murdoch media cover this by only quoting the South Australian Premier's references to its platforming a far-right Zionist at the festival, without actually acknowledging that the real concern and imputation here is that Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah might have held the same views as those who committed the Bondi terror attack, which just isn't the case, and actually is so blatantly offensive and disturbing for a Premier to be making. And so I think we actually need to sit with the fact that we have, the highest official in South Australia making these comments at a press conference, quite willy-nilly, and that is deeply irresponsible and that she deserves an apology.
You've touched on a little bit, Hannah, but what are the powers at play here? I mean, why do we keep seeing this type of thing happening in our cultural institutions?
I mean, over the last 2 years in particular, we have seen, from my perspective, over and over again, the Zionist lobbies at play here launching coordinated campaigns against particular voices in our media and political landscapes, and politicians are folding to the pressures. And so I think consistently that has been the recurring theme that needs to be named.
How do you think this whole saga will shape next year's festival and the programming decisions at other arts festivals? Could it have a chilling effect?
Yeah, I think that is the biggest risk we're facing, is that instead of, having arts festivals see this result and say we need to actually diversify our offerings, diversify our panels, diversify the experiences we're offering to audiences who have a passion and thirst for hearing from different voices, we will likely see some festivals take the approach of not inviting diverse voices and diverse authors to speak, and platforming Palestinian voices in particular. And the worry from my perspective is that instead we'll continue to see many of the kind of white, centrist, safe, polite conversations that have dominated the Australian media landscape for decades. But I also think when we're talking about the idea of a chilling effect, what's interesting is that we always kind of have this perspective that effect will take place on the festival, that it will center white voices, that it will actually remove diversity from these arenas. What we never really ask is why this doesn't have a chilling effect on the diversity of the board, but now has to be rehired. Who programs the festival? Will Louise Adler be invited back to be the director in 2027, and will she take that position? I hope that one of the outcomes from this cancellation and kind of horrific week of unfolding news is that boards moving forward reconsider how they make decisions, who is placed on them, and how they approach these contentious and conflicting issues.
And what does it say about our ability to have a mature conversation as we're about to embark on a Royal Commission that is potentially going to be very divisive? What does the events of Adelaide Writers' Week and the events before that in other cultural settings say about our ability to have these conversations?
You know what? I think that I have been someone who in the past, for the years I've been kind of entering this new media landscape, I have been very negative about the media and politics and, looking forward, trying to remain optimistic. It is quite difficult. But I actually think, and I'm sure Dr. Abdel Fattah might have very different views to me, having been on the receiving end of such harm by the media as well. I think the solidarity and the acts of protest from so many writers who work for mastheads, that it's sort of been a significant risk to them to boycott or pull out from the event. I think there's an actual positive here that so many people stood together and made clear statements that it wasn't acceptable. And I think that is a beautiful thing from many parts of the media. But I also think it speaks to the fact that so much of the political and media landscape right now is leaning into the inflammatory and running unfair headlines that take out of context particular authors' views and language, and that we are living in dangerous times where social media makes inflammatory headlines and clickable moments the dominant narrative rather than actual nuanced conversations that focus on productivity and how we move forward together.
Hannah, thank you so much for coming on 7am.
Thank you so much for having me.
Seven AM is a daily show from Solstice Media. It's made by Atticus Bastow, Ariel Richards, Chris Dangate, Daniel James, Crystal Keller, Nicole Johnston, Sarah McVie, Travis Evans and Zoltan Fetcho. Ruby Jones is on secondment and will be back at the end of March. Our theme music is by Ned Beckley and Josh Hogan of Envelope Audio. This has been 7am. Thanks so much for listening.